Good morning again. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your warm um, invitation and reception. Before I launch into this sermon, I have two brief quotes or reflections. The first is from Jabari Jones, who writes, "One thing I've learned is that at the core of white privilege is the entitlement to amnesia, denial, aversion, and ignorance. To forget that America was founded on stolen land, stolen labor, and genocide, and that we live in a society structured by this history, is to embrace an identity rooted in a false innocence, a practiced flight from truth, and an aversion to healing the wounds of the nation. This is the rot at the root of the nation, and telling the truth about our heritage is the only path to restoring integrity." The second is from Valerie Kaur. "In the United States, white supremacy is intertwined with Christian supremacy, one an extension of the other. Any theology that teaches that God will torture the people in front of you in the afterlife creates the imaginative space for you to do so yourself on earth." In June of this year, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman gave the 43rd annual Berry Street Address, a tradition which officially ends the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association's gathering and unofficially begins the General Assembly Conference of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Her subject was fascism, which automatically addressed the systemic harm and trauma which has unequally targeted each of us. It matters that we take this subject seriously, and so in the spirit of countering the fascism in this country, which is both its root and its rot, as Jabari Jones called it, I share some of Reverend Kingman's and others' thoughts mingled with my own. There is a reason for this choice of mine today. In this country, the impacts of fascism and authoritarianism have historically fallen most heavily upon our indigenous and black siblings and our other siblings of color. Far too often, white Unitarian Universalists like myself have asked our siblings of color to come before us and perform suffering for our consumption. I am no longer willing to participate in that kind of harm. Instead, today I rather ask for more labor from my fellow white UUs as we look specifically at the systems of oppression which are braided and enmeshed in the dominant paradigm of white supremacy, which is everywhere. Obviously, you don't need my permission to take care of yourself, but I want to be clear that people are free to move their bodies and release whatever somatic discomfort may arise from this sermon. I want you to experience freedom while I am talking about authoritarianism and fascism. Okay? Agree? Okay. And I invite you to take a deep breath. Thank you. I come from many generations of white settlers, colonizers, and oppressors. I was raised in a predominantly white, openly racist church, school, and social system. This history of my family and my upbringing was taught to me as part of the glorified lies most of us are told about our nation's founding, and is simply a fact and must be named. And so I have a personal connection to the project of violent conquest, genocide, and displacement. My family, my teachers, and my religious leaders didn't use those words, but that was the truth beneath the simple story. The covering up over generations of these brutalities does not mean that they have no impact. The Reverend Dr. Kingman wrote, "To be white in this country and to have lived here for more than one generation is to be a generational participant in massive historical violence and to have been enrolled in maintaining the mythologies that perpetuate that violence even to today. White children are forcefully and sometimes forcibly enrolled in the project of whiteness. White children are required to cut off parts of themselves in order to maintain societal, religious, and familial approval. Just as people assigned male or female as children are taught to behave in certain ways, so are white children taught to act in ways that distinguish those who are deemed white from those who are deemed not white. And thus some children are taught the myth of their own separateness and superiority. When, not if, but when, children fail to comply with those gendered or racialized expectations, they experience at minimum the removal of approval and connection. This is deeply traumatic to young children, and so we, learn to cut off parts of ourselves to stay connected and receive the benefits of being within the circle of privilege. To do this, we cut off our compassion, our sense of kinship with other people, and our emotional responses. Cutting off parts of ourselves to survive, which we all have likely done, injures our souls. For those of us who are white, being taught to overlook the atrocities done by our ancestors and the continued oppression and land identity and wealth theft being done by our people, especially when we are told that this oppression and theft is done to secure our own future, this is deeply injurious. This turning away from truth is demanded of children long before a child can be considered complicit. But even when young, most of us do have, deep down, an awareness that something isn't right, that we are being lied to, that we are being enrolled in, and then ultimately choosing to participate in a system of violent oppression. This awareness causes a particular form of moral injury that white people, especially white men, have been passing down generation after generation. And it is absolutely against the rules of whiteness to discuss these psychic wounds of learning to be an oppressor. Take a deep breath. Friends, this moral injury makes fertile ground for fascism. The belief in one's own special place, combined with the traumatic indoctrination into that belief, the immoral deal one must make to trade parts of oneself for a myth of superiority, this injury creates a psychological and moral framework that makes one vulnerable to fascist ideologies. I want to be clear. White people's moral injury and generational trauma are not comparable to the horrific violence directed at indigenous and black people. But white people must dig into their own generational trauma to understand our current situation. As the American psychotherapist Resmaa Menakem teaches in his brilliant book, My Grandmother's Hands, white nationalism gets its hooks into white people because of this unacknowledged, unhealed white trauma. Telling the truth and healing that trauma are crucial to the project of resisting fascism and freeing ourselves from its systemic generational legacies, end quote. So, this morning, I want to focus ever so briefly, although it may seem like an eternity, on recognizing and countering fascism within and without our own faith. Fascism without seems pretty obvious. We all know that we are in a moment of grave danger. If anyone is left wondering how bad it is, it's very, very bad. It's alarmingly easy, however, for us to grow acclimated and numb unless we pay rigorous attention to the strategies and timelines being used upon us. We are also seeing a rise in fascist thinking within our own faith communities. not necessarily the political ideologies we associate with fascism, but the style of thinking. Please understand that I do not say this lightly. Unitarian Universalism is currently in a moment of major theological transformation and institutional reform. This transition is causing a backlash within our congregations and among some ministerial colleagues. We are moving away from individualism to more communitarian values, from white supremacy culture to truly radical liberation, from a concentration of power among historically privileged groups and towards a new form of power sharing. Some are responding to these shifts with anxiety and conflict. Some who are being asked to give up the primacy of their privilege and power are responding with tactics drawn from fascist politics. It's not surprising. The Protestant tradition in North America, the tradition in which most of us are rooted, has been utterly complicit in the project of fascism and white supremacy. Our faith tradition is rooted in historic hierarchies, the very hierarchies that fascists seek to protect and restore. We have a lot of work to do to dig out the roots of these practices and bravely choose healing alternatives. The current Article 2 project within Unitarian Universalism is offering every congregation to do its own heavy lifting. I do not have time to address this project in this sermon, but I do hope that this congregation is committed to the important work of radical liberation in this way. And I thank you for pausing from all the other usual business of congregational life and taking up this mantle as well. It is plain that in the United States we are in the midst of an orchestrated takeover by fascist political groups. The legislative attacks on the last few months and the civil violence where domestic extremists act to create fear in targeted groups are all on the rise. Remember, fascism is inherently violent and it begins with seemingly random acts. But those domestic terrorists are part of the overall plan. Fascist politicians use stochastic terrorism, in which leaders use hate speech to incite seemingly random violence, because a terrified population is more easily controlled. And a terrified population will look for scapegoats and easy answers and aversions to their discomfort. It's vital to understand that we are past the point of simply voting fascists out. We have entered an era of violent civil conflict. Voter organizing is no longer a fully sufficient strategy, and we can't keep careening from one election cycle to another. We must work in coalitions to shape a multi-year plan for keeping these fascist politics in check. The ideas of fascism have been activated in a time of great anxiety. Anxiety about global immigration patterns, anxiety about technological changes, anxiety about demographic trends, and about climate disasters and wars for resources. Amidst all this anxiety, people look for simple answers, and fascist politicians supply those answers all too readily, usually by scapegoating. Voting is important, but our immediate moral obligation is to help people out of the path of direct harm. In the current fascist mythology, the nation has become degenerate because it has fallen away from certain hierarchies, particularly racial or gender hierarchies. And the only way to restore the nation to greatness again is to undergo a regeneration, a rebirth, a reclamation of those hierarchies. The goal is always the same: the maintenance of power in the hands of a dictator or a group of people through the use of control and forced conformity. Conformity and control are the opposite of freedom. Conformity and control are the opposite of freedom. Fascists enforce conformity and control because for fascists to remain in power, they must limit all true expressions of human freedom. Freedom overthrows hierarchies, and without hierarchies, there is no way to retain the power fascists seek. And here I'd like to focus on the current rise of book banning that we see escalating across the country by an organized coalition using fascist tactics to erode freedom and maintain oppressive hierarchy. The American Library Association, ALA, has documented over 680 challenges to books through the first 8 months of 2023, involving 1,651 different titles. 1,650 different titles. Because the ALA relies on media accounts and reports from libraries, the Library Association believes the actual number of challenges is likely far higher. As an example of tactics being used, the Florida House Bill 1467 mandates that a school's books be age appropriate, free from pornography, and suited to students' needs. Put that way, that seems reasonable and rational. I'm assuming you may feel the same way too. No pornography in school literature seems like a no-brainer, except here's the rub. We're talking about books like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter by Erika Sanchez, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Forever by Judy Blume, and Looking for Alaska by John Green. As the organization PEN America so aptly says, none of these books remotely fit the well-established legal and colloquial definitions of pornography. Rhetoric about porn in schools has also been advanced as justification for the passage or introduction of new state laws, some of which would bar any books with sexual content and could easily sweep up a wide swath of literature and health-related content. So given the vagueness and ambiguity of these state laws, school districts are going into panic mode. Librarians are stymieing the purchase of new books to libraries, and both librarians and teachers alike are anxious about complying with the letter of the law. In Florida, for instance, if a teacher in a classroom doesn't comply with books that are deemed banned by a district, which, by the way, non-compliance could just mean that they have the book on the shelf in their classroom, the teacher could face a third-degree felony charge with up to 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. But this book banning business is not just a threat to our democracy. It is also, and perhaps most importantly, a threat to our humanity. It is a threat to us being able to realize our full humanity. So many of the books that are banned or challenged are marginal voices, people of color, women, LGBTQ+ youth and adults, stories from countries where the population have hardship and despair in their everyday existence, and I can't even begin to understand or imagine. And yet, it is through a book that I can work on my empathy muscles. I can, with a book, confront my day-to-day life. I can challenge my own beliefs and perspectives and learn to cultivate empathy for others. Empathy, in my mind, is a form of love. It's an expansion of the self. It's an opening, a widening of our circles of concern. It is seeing another's humanity, their struggles and their pain, as our struggles and pain. Books allow us to experience the necessary discomfort that's essential for growth. Empathy is exercising my spiritual muscles of growth, transformation, and the transforming power of love. Once you have read a book by someone from a walk of life other than your own and practiced the art of empathy, you can never hate them, at least not if you're intellectually honest. It's this empathy muscle that gets us out of the morass of false categories, nuance-crushing stereotypes, black and white thinking, and general fascist oppression. Oscar Wilde once said, "The books that the world calls immoral are books that show the world its own shame." My friends, there is a specific reason why we are seeing a focused attack on trans rights at this moment. It's because under fascism, difference cannot be allowed to flourish, because difference is a form of freedom, and freedom of human expression must be suppressed. Fascists attempt to keep everyone within the narrow roles prescribed to us and will punish or eliminate anyone who deviates. It is crucial to understand this. Attacks on trans folks are an intentional opening salvo and first target of this round of fascist organizing. In addition to hating any kind of free self-expression, fascists also always try out their tactics on the most vulnerable group. They believe, often rightly, that other people will not act to protect the most vulnerable, especially when they identify a difference that is misunderstood or even generally reviled. Right now, fascists are gauging the public's response, but they will not stop with our trans children and siblings, and the impact falls most heavily on our trans siblings who are also Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor, and/or disabled. Fascists will see what the public allows and will move to control increasingly broader categories. Queer people, immigrants, people of color, Indigenous folks, women, in great broad swaths. They intend to make all of us conform. Remember that law and order means conforming to the hierarchies or be eliminated. It helps me to think of fascism as a hydra. In Greek mythology, Hercules was tasked with killing the Hydra, a multi-headed snake creature. The Hydra seemed impossible to kill because every time you cut off one head, it was replaced by two more. Ultimately, Hercules killed the beast by getting help from his nephew to cut off the Hydra's main head. This is another opportunity to remind ourselves that the myth of the rugged individualist, the lone hero, is a useless myth. A Hydra is a multifarious evil that cannot be overcome by a single effort. We have to fight on all fronts, while remembering that these heads all grow out of one body. Our coalitions must oppose the fascist desire to control anyone and everyone in order to take and retain power. For centuries, marginalized people have not seen themselves reflected in the wider culture, including as characters in a book. This book-banning backlash is trying to take away those gains. It is literally trying to remove stories in which marginalized people see themselves. And none of us can realize our full humanity when society doesn't affirmatively mirror us back to ourselves. Let me pause and sum it up. For me, and friends, I think perhaps for all of us, the reason I'm alarmed by this new book banning movement is that it threatens not just our democracy, but also our humanity, our ability to realize the fullness of humanity. So if we look back, way, way, way back to our heritage as religious people, we have the perfect guide to rouse us, remind us, and pass on the importance of this mission before us. one of the heroes of our faith, one of our founding fathers, if you will, was a guy named Michael Servetus. Have you heard the name? Michael Servetus, Miguel Servet, was a Spanish theologian, physician, cartographer, and Renaissance humanist. He was also a burr under the saddle of the establishment. There used to be a bust of him in some of our churches. Servetus wrote a book on the errors of the Trinity during the Reformation that denounced the Christian Trinity as historically inaccurate, which is historically accurate. His was a minor opinion, but true nonetheless. Now, this is the 1500s, and well, guess what? You can get in a lot of trouble for a book like that, and he did. At the time of publication, he was living in France, and the Catholics wanted him gone. They wanted nothing to do with him. Things were getting heated for Servetus, so he went to Geneva, where John Calvin himself, the founder of the Presbyterian movement, wanted him gone as well. And it was Calvin who helped ultimately give enough leverage to claim Servetus as a heretic. The word heretic means one who chooses. That sounds so benign, doesn't it? Being called a heretic? But in his time, being a heretic was punishable by death. To choose something other was punishable by death. And sure enough, this brilliant man was burned at the stake. His books were burned along with him, and evidently he had one strapped to his thigh as he was consumed by flames. Now, why tell you this story? Because our tradition had people willing to die for the right to expand the human imagination. Our religious ancestors and antecedents knew that books helped you reflect on one's humanity, gain larger insights about the human condition, and expand your empathy. And because of him, I have this little fantasy. How awesome would it be if we all walked around with banned books strapped to our thighs? We could whip them out and hand them out to people because we are so passionate about the importance of helping people live into their full humanity. It might be a little startling to some, but we could live with that. Now, that is tongue and cheek, of course, but metaphorically, I don't think it would hurt us to think of our favorite banned book and imagine that we've strapped it to our thigh so that everywhere we went, we were on the lookout to help others and ourselves remember the importance of growing our empathy and ensuring marginalized people feel seen and heard, and that we are countering in all the ways we can the rise of fascism wherever it shows its multiple heads. May it be so. Amen.